Heavenly Father, we come into this morning with gratitude for the gift of life and the mercy that has carried us into a new day. On this 13th of June, 2026, we pause at the beginning of this Saturday to realign our hearts with you, to quiet every voice of fear, doubt, and distraction, and to focus our minds on your truth. Lord, as this day unfolds, we ask that your presence goes before us. Order our steps, guide our decisions, and strengthen our inner man so that we do not walk by confusion but by clarity, not by anxiety but by divine peace. Let every burden that tried to follow us from yesterday lose its power right now in the name of Jesus. We surrender this day into your hands. Fill our thoughts with wisdom, our words with grace, and our actions with purpose. Where there is weakness, release strength. Where there is uncertainty, release direction. Where there is heaviness, release joy that cannot be explained by circumstances. We declare that this morning is not ordinary. It is appointed, it is protected, and it is aligned with your purpose. Let everything we do today carry divine favor and spiritual covering. And as we begin this prayer, we open our hearts fully to receive from you without resistance, without hesitation, and without fear. We come into this moment with a conscious decision to lay down every concern, every expectation, every hidden fear, and every plan that has been forming in our own understanding, and we place it intentionally into the hands of God, acknowledging that today is not a random unfolding of time, but a divinely permitted space where heaven intersects with earth in ways we may not fully perceive yet still deeply rely upon. And in this posture of surrender, we are not speaking from weakness, but from wisdom, because true strength is found in yielding control to the one who already sees the full picture from beginning to end. And so as this day begins to open before us, we choose to release the illusion that we must carry everything by ourselves, that we must fix everything in our own timing, or that we must force outcomes through human effort alone. And instead, we acknowledge that there is a higher orchestration at work, one that aligns circumstances, people, opportunities, and even delays in ways that ultimately serve a greater purpose than what our immediate understanding can grasp. And in surrendering this day, we are also surrendering our mental resistance, those inner arguments that constantly try to predict failure or rehearse worry. And we bring those thoughts into submission, allowing peace to take the place of mental chaos, allowing trust to replace anxiety, and allowing faith to become the governing force behind every decision we will make as the hours unfold. And even now, in this early moment of the day, there is a recognition that every breath we take is evidence of grace. Every heartbeat is a testimony of preservation. And every step we are allowed to take is already surrounded by unseen mercy that has positioned us here without our awareness of all the things that could have gone differently, but did not. And so in this surrender, we are not just giving up burdens. We are also receiving perspective, the perspective that nothing in this day is beyond divine awareness. Nothing is hidden from divine sight, and nothing that concerns us is too small to be held within divine care. And as we yield this day into higher hands, we also release the need to control outcomes that have not yet arrived, understanding that control is often an expression of fear disguised as responsibility. And we are choosing instead to operate from trust, where we believe that even when we do not see immediate results, there is still movement beneath the surface, still alignment happening beyond what is visible, still preparation occurring in spaces we cannot access. And so we step away from striving and step into surrender, not as passivity, but as alignment, not as resignation, but as positioning. And in this positioning, we allow divine order to recalibrate our priorities so that what we once thought was urgent may no longer hold the same weight. And what we once overlooked may become the very place where direction begins to form. And as we continue in this surrender, we acknowledge that there are things we cannot change, things we cannot predict, and things we cannot prevent. Yet there is also a deep assurance that none of these unknowns are outside the reach of divine governance. And so we release the tension of needing certainty before we move forward. And instead we embrace a step-by-step obedience where clarity is revealed in motion rather than waiting in stagnation. And as this day now unfolds in its early rhythm, we also surrender our expectations, those silent demands we place on how people should act, how situations should unfold, and how timing should align. And we recognize that unmet expectations are often the source of unnecessary frustration. And so we loosen our grip on them, allowing grace to shape our responses instead of frustration, allowing patience to guide our interactions instead of irritation, and allowing understanding to soften our reactions instead of judgment. And in this surrendered state, we become more aware of divine timing, which does not always align with human urgency, but always aligns with purpose. And as we continue to place this day into divine hands, we also surrender our internal narrative, the way we speak to ourselves when no one is listening, the way doubt tries to rewrite our identity, and the way past experiences attempt to define future possibilities. And we declare that none of those voices will have authority over this day, because this day belongs to a higher truth that speaks life, direction, and purpose over every situation we will encounter. And even now, as we continue in this posture, there is a deep settling within the spirit, a quieting of internal noise, a softening of resistance, and an openness to receive guidance in ways that may not come loudly, but will come clearly through wisdom, through peace, through timing, through doors that open and close without confusion, and through moments that redirect our attention without force. And as we remain in this surrender, we are aware that this is not a one-time action, but a continuous posture that will be required throughout the day. In conversations, in decisions, in unexpected challenges, and in quiet moments where choices must be made without full information. And in each of these, we return again and again to this place of surrender, releasing control, receiving guidance, and allowing this day to be shaped not by pressure, but by purpose. We step into this moment with a deliberate awareness that we are not walking alone, and that every part of this day requires more than human ability, more than personal strategy, and more than emotional strength, because there is a dimension of guidance that surpasses natural thinking. And in inviting divine presence to lead every step, we are acknowledging that direction is not merely something we create, but something we receive, something that is revealed progressively as we remain attentive and surrendered. And so we begin this inner alignment by turning our attention away from the noise of self-reliance and toward the stillness of divine leading, where clarity is not forced but gently revealed, where direction is not confused but steadily unfolded, and where each step becomes meaningful because it is connected to a higher awareness that sees beyond immediate outcomes. And as we open ourselves to this presence, we recognize that guidance is not always loud or dramatic, but often comes in subtle impressions, in peace that settles in one direction more than another, in doors that feel aligned without full explanation, and in resistances that signal redirection rather than delay. And so we become attentive not just to external signs, but to internal clarity that is shaped by divine influence. And in this attentiveness, we begin to slow down the urgency that often drives our decisions, because urgency can sometimes cloud perception. And in slowing down, we allow wisdom to rise above impulse and understanding to rise above reaction. And as we continue to invite divine presence into every step, we also acknowledge that guidance requires relationship, not just request, meaning that we are not simply asking for direction, but cultivating sensitivity, a responsiveness that allows correction without resistance, adjustment without frustration, and redirection without confusion. And in this space, we begin to trust that even pauses are part of guidance, even delays are part of instruction, and even closed doors are part of protection. Because divine presence does not only lead us toward what is ahead, but also away from what would hinder us. And so every movement becomes meaningful, every pause becomes instructional, and every shift becomes intentional. And as this awareness deepens, we begin to release the need to see the full map before taking the next step, because guidance is often given in portions, enough for obedience, but not always enough for complete prediction. And in this, we learn dependence not as limitation, but as design, where each step builds trust, each decision strengthens sensitivity, and each moment of obedience opens greater clarity for the next. And as we continue to open ourselves to this leading, we also become aware that divine presence does not compete with chaos, but brings order within it, not always by removing complexity, but by granting peace within complexity. And so even when circumstances feel uncertain, we are able to remain anchored because guidance is not dependent on external stability, but on internal alignment. And in this alignment, we find that peace becomes a compass, not just an emotion, and clarity becomes a direction, not just a thought. And as we continue to yield every step to this higher leading, we also recognize that mistakes are often the result of disconnection rather than lack of intelligence. And so we choose connection over independence, awareness over assumption, and sensitivity over self-direction, allowing each moment to be filtered through a deeper awareness that checks motives, refines intentions, and aligns actions with purpose. And as we remain in this posture, we begin to notice that divine presence often speaks through restraint as much as through movement, guiding us by what to avoid as much as by what to pursue. And in this balanced guidance, we are no longer rushing ahead blindly nor hesitating unnecessarily, but moving in rhythm with a steady inner assurance that what is meant for us will not require force, confusion, or compromise. And so we continue to walk through this day with a growing dependence that is not heavy but freeing, because being led removes the burden of figuring everything out alone and instead replaces it with the simplicity of following what is already being made clear in each unfolding moment. And as this awareness continues to deepen, we find ourselves becoming more observant, more patient, more receptive, and more willing to adjust without resistance, allowing divine presence to shape not only our steps, but also our timing, our responses, our interactions, and even our pauses, so that nothing in this day is disconnected from guidance, and everything becomes part of a continuous unfolding path shaped by wisdom that is higher than our own understanding. We bring our attention into a place of spiritual awareness where we recognize that fear, doubt, and confusion are not just emotions passing through the mind, but forces that attempt to distort perception, weaken confidence, and interrupt clarity. And in this recognition, we make a deliberate decision to disengage from every internal voice that does not align with peace, truth, and stability. Because fear often presents itself as warning but operates as limitation, doubt often presents itself as caution but operates as paralysis, and confusion often presents itself as complexity but operates as delay. And so we begin to separate what is real from what is imposed, what is truth from what is assumption, and what is divine direction from what is internal noise. And in this separation, we take authority over our thought life, choosing not to entertain spiraling narratives that lead us away from confidence and into hesitation. And as we do this, we begin to recognize that many of the chains we experience are not external but internal patterns of thinking that replay uncertainty until it feels like reality. And so we interrupt those patterns not with emotional reaction, but with intentional redirection, shifting our focus from fear-based thinking to faith-based awareness, from uncertainty to trust, from imagined outcomes of failure to grounded assurance that we are being guided even when we do not yet see the full picture. And in this shift, there is a breaking of invisible pressure, a loosening of mental tension, and a restoration of inner stability that allows us to breathe again with clarity rather than heaviness. And as we continue in this awareness, we acknowledge that doubt often tries to attach itself to identity, whispering that we are unprepared, unworthy, or incapable, but we reject these narratives as distortions that do not reflect truth. And instead, we anchor ourselves in a deeper understanding that capability is not solely dependent on personal strength, but on alignment with purpose. And when alignment is present, strength is supplied, clarity is supplied, and direction is supplied in ways that go beyond natural limitation. And so we stop measuring ourselves by fluctuating emotions and start recognizing that stability comes from anchoring our thoughts in a higher truth that does not change with circumstances. And as we continue to release confusion, we understand that confusion is often the result of too many competing voices, too many unfiltered influences, and too many unexamined assumptions. And so we begin to simplify our inner environment by removing mental clutter, reducing unnecessary speculation, and refusing to give space to thoughts that have no constructive purpose. And in this simplification, clarity begins to rise naturally, not because everything outside becomes easier, but because the mind becomes more aligned, more centered, and more focused on what is essential. And as this clarity grows, we find that fear loses its grip not through struggle, but through exposure to truth, because fear cannot sustain itself where understanding is present, and doubt cannot remain where confidence is anchored, and confusion cannot dominate where order is established. And so we allow truth to reframe our internal dialogue, replacing assumptions of danger with awareness of protection, replacing assumptions of failure with expectation of guidance, and replacing assumptions of abandonment with awareness of presence. And as we continue in this inner transformation, we also recognize that emotional responses often intensify situations beyond their actual weight, causing temporary feelings to appear as permanent realities. So we choose to observe rather than be consumed, to acknowledge without surrendering authority, and to remain steady even when emotions attempt to amplify uncertainty. And in this steadiness, we find that peace becomes not a reaction to circumstances, but a chosen state of awareness that we return to repeatedly. And as we continue to reject confusion, we also begin to recognize patterns that previously went unnoticed. Patterns where fear disguised itself as logic, where doubt disguised itself as careful thinking, and where confusion disguised itself as complexity. And now, with clearer perception, we are able to see these patterns and disengage from them before they take root. And in doing so, we reclaim mental space that had been occupied by unnecessary tension. And as that space opens, we begin to fill it with trust, with grounded assurance, and with the understanding that we are not navigating this day blindly, but with direction that unfolds progressively. And as we maintain this posture of release, we also acknowledge that breaking fear is not a one-time event, but a continuous choice, requiring repeated redirection throughout the day whenever old patterns attempt to return. And in each moment of return, we choose again clarity over confusion, peace over anxiety, and trust over uncertainty, allowing this consistent choice to gradually reshape not only our thoughts, but also our responses, our decisions, and our perception of what is possible in this day. We step into an awareness that today is not a scattered sequence of random events, but a divinely ordered pathway where peace, clarity, and alignment are meant to govern our inner world regardless of external conditions. And in this declaration, we begin to separate our inner state from outer circumstances, refusing to allow shifting situations to dictate the stability of our spirit. And instead, we anchor ourselves in a deeper assurance that peace is not something we wait to receive, but something we choose to inhabit. And as we embrace this understanding, we begin to notice how easily the mind can be pulled into turbulence when it is not intentionally governed, how quickly thoughts can drift into uncertainty when they are not anchored, and how easily emotions can amplify minor disruptions into major disturbances. And so we consciously choose to bring our attention back into alignment, allowing peace to become the governing atmosphere of our thoughts, decisions, and reactions. And as we do this, we recognize that clarity is not always found by adding more thoughts, but often by removing unnecessary ones, by simplifying what has become mentally overloaded, and by returning to what is essential rather than what is distracting. And in this simplification, we begin to feel a release from internal pressure, as though the weight of overthinking is being lifted and replaced with a calm steadiness that allows us to see more clearly and respond more wisely. And as we continue in this awareness, we understand that alignment is not forced but cultivated, not rushed but maintained, and not dependent on perfection but on intentional focus. And so even when distractions arise, we do not interpret them as failure, but as opportunities to realign, to refocus, and to return again to a centered state of peace. And in this process, we also recognize that many disturbances in life gain strength only when we engage them without clarity. But when we respond from a place of peace, their influence begins to diminish because peace carries an authority that confusion cannot sustain itself against. And so we begin to practice responding from stability rather than reaction, choosing to pause internally before reacting externally, allowing clarity to filter our words, our decisions, and our emotional responses. And as we maintain this discipline, we begin to notice that external situations, though still present, no longer dictate internal chaos, and instead they become moments where we can demonstrate calm awareness, grounded thinking, and steady presence. And in this steadiness, we also begin to understand that alignment is not only personal, but also relational, meaning that when we are aligned internally, our interactions with others become less reactive and more thoughtful, less defensive and more understanding, less driven by emotion and more guided by wisdom. And so peace begins to influence not only our private thoughts, but also our public expression, shaping the way we communicate, the way we interpret others, and the way we navigate conflict or misunderstanding. And as we continue to deepen in this awareness, we recognize that disruption often seeks attention, but peace does not compete. It simply remains steady. And in that steadiness, it creates clarity even in environments that are not yet calm. And so we learn to carry peace into situations rather than waiting for situations to become peaceful, understanding that internal alignment often precedes external transformation. And as we walk in this understanding, we also acknowledge that there will be moments when old patterns attempt to reintroduce anxiety or agitation. But instead of being drawn into those patterns, we choose to return to the center, to the place of calm awareness where thoughts are not racing but ordered, where emotions are not overwhelming but balanced, and where decisions are not rushed but guided. And in this returning, we strengthen our ability to remain aligned even under pressure, building resilience that is not dependent on favorable conditions but rooted in internal stability. And as this alignment continues to grow, we begin to experience a subtle but powerful shift in perception, where challenges no longer appear as threats but as manageable moments, where uncertainty no longer feels like danger but like space for trust, and where delays no longer feel like denial but like quiet preparation unfolding beneath the surface. And in this shift, we begin to live from a place where peace is not occasional but foundational, not fragile but steady, and not easily disrupted but consistently restored through awareness and intention, allowing this day to unfold under a covering of calm strength that remains present, regardless of external change. We step into this awareness with the understanding that life is not merely sustained by what we can see, prepare, or control, but also by a covering that extends beyond human limitation, a protection that operates in dimensions we do not always perceive yet continuously benefit from. And in recognizing this, we begin to shift from a mindset of vulnerability rooted in self-reliance to a mindset of security rooted in divine guardianship. And as this shift takes place, we become more aware that every day carries unseen movements, unseen interventions, and unseen adjustments that preserve, redirect, and shield us from outcomes we may never fully know about. And so we no longer interpret safety as coincidence or luck, but as intentional covering that surrounds our coming in and our going out. And in this understanding, we begin to release the constant internal tension that comes from trying to anticipate every risk, every delay, and every possible disruption. Because the truth is that human awareness is limited, but divine covering is not. And so we begin to rest in the awareness that even what we cannot monitor is still being overseen. Even what we cannot predict is still being governed. And even what we cannot defend against is still being held within a higher safeguard. And as we continue in this awareness, we begin to see that protection is not only about preventing harm, but also about positioning, about being guided away from what would drain, delay, or destroy purpose, and toward what strengthens, aligns, and builds destiny. And so we understand that divine covering does not always announce itself in dramatic rescue moments, but often reveals itself through subtle redirections, through closed doors that we later understand were protection, through delays that prevented unnecessary exposure, through interruptions that shifted us away from unseen harm, and through moments of hesitation that saved us from decisions we were not yet prepared to handle. And in this recognition, we begin to trust even what we do not immediately understand, allowing faith to fill the gap between what is visible and what is working beneath the surface. And as this trust deepens, we begin to release the fear that we are exposed or unguarded, because we recognize that protection is not dependent on our awareness of it, but on its continuous operation. And so even in moments where we feel uncertain, we begin to affirm internally that we are not uncovered, not unprotected, and not unguarded, but instead surrounded by a covering that does not sleep, does not weaken, and does not withdraw. And as we continue to internalize this truth, we begin to walk with a different posture, not one of anxiety, but one of assurance, not one of hesitation, but one of grounded movement. Because when a person knows they are covered, they no longer move as though they are exposed to every threat. And so our decisions begin to shift from fear-based avoidance to wisdom-based confidence, where we are still aware, still discerning, but no longer driven by panic or suspicion. And as we continue in this awareness, we also recognize that protection extends into our mind, guarding against intrusive thoughts that attempt to destabilize peace, guarding against mental patterns that exaggerate danger, and guarding against emotional responses that amplify uncertainty. And so we begin to notice that even within internal battles, there is a stabilizing force that prevents us from being overwhelmed, allowing us to recover more quickly from anxiety, to regain clarity more easily after confusion, and to return to peace even after moments of emotional disturbance. And as this covering continues to be acknowledged, we also begin to see that it influences relationships, guiding interactions away from unnecessary conflict, aligning conversations in ways that prevent misunderstanding, and sometimes even creating distance from situations that would have led to unnecessary strain. And in this, we learn that protection is not always about keeping us in every environment, but sometimes about separating us from environments that are not aligned with our preservation. And so we begin to trust not only what remains, but also what is removed, not only what continues, but also what ends. And in this trust, we find that surrender and safety are deeply connected, because the more we surrender control, the more we become aware of the covering that was already in place. And as we continue in this awareness, we also recognize that protection is not passive but active, not distant but present, not occasional but continuous, surrounding decisions, movements, transitions, and even silent moments when nothing seems to be happening outwardly, yet preservation is still taking place inwardly. And so we begin to walk through this day with a deeper sensitivity, acknowledging that we are not stepping into unknown exposure, but into guided coverage, where even uncertainty is held within a framework of unseen stability. And as this awareness settles within us, we begin to release the need to constantly defend ourselves emotionally or mentally against imagined outcomes. And instead, we allow a calm confidence to grow that does not ignore reality, but is not ruled by fear of it. And in this growing confidence, we begin to move more freely, think more clearly, and respond more wisely, knowing that what is meant to harm cannot override what is already being held within a greater protection. And as this understanding continues to expand within us, we remain in a posture of awareness, of gratitude, and of steady recognition that every step today is already being watched over, guided, and preserved in ways that are both seen and unseen. We step into this awareness with a deeper recognition that every moment of this day requires not only action but insight, not only effort but understanding, and not only movement but discernment. Because decisions made without wisdom often lead to unnecessary complexity, while decisions guided by wisdom tend to create alignment, clarity, and long-term stability. And so we begin by acknowledging that wisdom is not simply intellectual knowledge or accumulated experience, but a higher form of understanding that allows us to see beyond surface level options and into the deeper consequences, patterns, and outcomes that are not immediately visible. And as we open ourselves to this flow of wisdom, we begin to shift from impulsive thinking to reflective awareness, from reactive decision making to intentional discernment, and from scattered thoughts to focused clarity. And in this shift, we also recognize that strength is not only measured by how much we can endure, but by how wisely we can navigate. Because endurance without direction can lead to exhaustion, while wisdom-guided strength leads to purposeful progress. And so we begin to invite a deeper intelligence into our thinking process, one that helps us pause before reacting, consider before speaking, and observe before concluding. And as we do this, we start to notice that many complications in life are not necessarily caused by external events, but by internal decisions made without clarity. And so we become more intentional about filtering our thoughts, examining our motives, and aligning our choices with what brings peace rather than confusion. And as this awareness grows, we begin to understand that wisdom often speaks in subtle ways, through a sense of peace in one direction and discomfort in another, through clarity that emerges when we slow down rather than rush, and through insights that come when we are willing to listen rather than insist on our own understanding. And so we develop the habit of listening inwardly before acting outwardly, allowing space for clarity to form before commitment is made. And in this space, we begin to experience a reduction in unnecessary mistakes, misunderstandings, and emotional reactions that often arise from acting too quickly. And as we continue in this awareness, we also recognize that wisdom is closely connected to humility, because the willingness to admit that we do not see everything clearly opens the door for deeper understanding, while overconfidence in our limited perspective often leads to repeated correction through experience. And so we begin to embrace humility not as weakness, but as openness, a posture that allows guidance to flow without resistance, correction to be received without defensiveness. and direction to be accepted without pride. And in this posture, we become more teachable in every moment of the day, recognizing that wisdom can come through circumstances, through conversations, through silence, and even through unexpected interruptions that redirect our attention away from what is less important toward what is more aligned. And as we remain in this awareness, we begin to see that wisdom also helps us distinguish between urgency and importance. Because not everything that demands attention deserves priority, and not everything that feels pressing is actually significant in the long-term unfolding of our path. And so we begin to slow down our internal urgency and allow clarity to determine our priorities rather than pressure. And in doing so, we begin to feel a release from the constant mental pressure of needing to respond to everything immediately. And instead, we begin to operate from a place of thoughtful awareness where each action is considered, each response is measured, and each decision is aligned with deeper purpose. And as this continues to develop, we also notice that wisdom helps us navigate relationships with greater understanding, allowing us to respond rather than react, to listen rather than assume, and to interpret situations with patience rather than judgment. And in this way, many potential conflicts are avoided, many misunderstandings are clarified before they escalate, and many emotional tensions are softened before they become overwhelming. And as we continue to walk in this awareness, we also recognize that wisdom is not static but active, not distant but present, and not reserved for rare moments but available in everyday choices, meaning that even in the simplest decisions, there is an opportunity to access clarity that shapes outcomes in meaningful ways. And so we begin to treat each moment as an opportunity to align with deeper understanding, whether in speech, in planning, in response, or in silence. And as this alignment grows, we begin to notice that life feels less chaotic, not because external conditions have necessarily changed, but because internal perception has shifted, allowing us to see more clearly, respond more calmly, and move more intentionally. And in this growing awareness, we continue to open ourselves to guidance that refines thinking, strengthens discernment, and leads us into decisions that carry peace rather than regret, clarity rather than confusion, and direction rather than uncertainty. We step into this final awareness with a deep recognition that today is not governed by randomness, but by alignment, not driven by uncertainty, but by purpose, and not shaped by fear, but by a higher order that is already working in our favor, even when we cannot yet see the full evidence of it. And so we begin to release the internal pressure of trying to predict how everything will unfold, and instead embrace the steady confidence that we are being led, we are being guided, and we are being positioned in ways that serve a greater outcome than what immediate understanding can grasp. And as we enter this mindset, we begin to recognize that favor is not something we chase, but something that flows when alignment is present. Because favor is not merely external approval, but a convergence of timing, opportunity, and readiness that creates access beyond natural effort. And so we begin to shift from striving to alignment, from forcing outcomes to positioning ourselves correctly, and from anxiety about results to trust in process. And as this shift takes place, we also begin to understand that today carries opportunities that are not always obvious at first glance, moments that may appear ordinary but hold extraordinary significance, conversations that may seem simple but carry directional influence, and decisions that may seem small but open pathways that lead far beyond their immediate scope. And so we begin to approach each moment with awareness, not urgency, with attentiveness, not pressure, and with expectation, not fear. And in this state of awareness, we also begin to release the tendency to underestimate ourselves. Because many times doubt does not come from truth, but from comparison, past experience, or temporary limitation. And so we choose to rise above those internal narratives and recognize that readiness is not always about perfection, but about willingness, about being present in the moment and responsive to what is required. And as we continue in this awareness, we also recognize that favor often manifests through alignment with people, opportunities, and environments that were not previously visible. And so we remain open, not closed, receptive, not resistant, and willing to engage with what is being revealed rather than what we expected to see. And as this openness grows, we begin to notice that life begins to move with a different rhythm, where delays are no longer interpreted as denial, but as preparation, where interruptions are no longer seen as inconvenience but as redirection, and where closed doors are no longer viewed as rejection but as protection and guidance towards something more suitable. And in this understanding, we begin to walk with a quiet confidence that does not depend on external validation, but on internal assurance that we are being carried forward by a purposeful design. And as we continue in this awareness, we also recognize that alignment with favor requires attentiveness, because favor often requires recognition, and recognition requires awareness, and awareness requires presence, meaning that we cannot afford to move through this day distracted, disconnected, or mentally absent, but instead we remain grounded in each moment, noticing what is unfolding, responding with clarity, and adjusting with wisdom. And as we do this, we begin to see that even challenges carry within them hidden pathways, opportunities that are only revealed when approached with the right mindset. And so we begin to approach every situation not with resistance, but with curiosity, not with fear, but with expectation that something meaningful can emerge even from difficulty. And as this perspective deepens, we also begin to understand that favor is not always loud or obvious, but often quiet, subtle, and woven into the details of timing, placement, and interaction. And so we learn to value small moments, to recognize significance in subtle shifts, and to appreciate the unfolding process rather than rushing toward outcomes. And in this appreciation, we find that pressure begins to decrease, anxiety begins to dissolve, and a steady confidence begins to take its place, allowing us to move through the day with greater ease, greater clarity, and greater trust that what is meant for us will align at the right time, in the right way, and through the right path. And as we continue in this awareness, we remain open to being guided, positioned, and aligned in ways that reflect purpose beyond immediate understanding,